For many of us who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s and grew up on reality TV shows like Making the Band, some reality TV moments will always stick with us, like that infamous walk for cheesecake.
Puffy just told us to go to the store in Brooklyn and bring him back a cheesecake and walk.
Say what?
Now back then as a viewer, it might have been funny, but putting a 2025 lens on things, especially with Diddy in jail awaiting trial for sex trafficking and the many lawsuits accusing him of sexual misconduct, Diddy's treatment of the artists he was trying to mold into stars doesn't look so funny now. In one of the latest lawsuits Diddy's facing, a former contestant on that hit show is suing him for a whopping $60 million. I'm Elizabeth Millner for Law&Crime. And the nearly 150-page filing, Sara Rivers, then known as Sarah Stokes, describes an awful and terrifying experience being a contestant, only for it to get worse when she actually made the band. Now, the lawsuit includes allegations of sexual harassment, forcible touching, and when she told Diddy no, well, he allegedly fired her and blacklisted her from the music industry. Sara Rivers named nearly 30 defendants in her lawsuit beyond Diddy. It named former Bad Boy Records president Harve Pierre, Diddy's former assistants like Farnsworth Bentley, Making the Band boot camp instructors, dance choreographers, Diddy's mom Janice Combs, Paramount, Viacom, MTV, and more. According to the filing, defendants Lou Pearlman, Burr & Murray Productions, MTV, and UMG offered Diddy the show to repair his image after the 2001 criminal trial where his former protege Shine was sentenced to a decade in prison. So I mentioned the complaint is nearly 150 pages. The start of the complaint lists out all the defendants and mainly their ties to Diddy, so that took up more than 20 pages. Then from page 26 to 74, it describes every single episode of the show Sara was on, from episode 1 where Sara the plaintiff meets Diddy, then episode 3 where the contestants enter the Bad Boy boot camp to make the group, and from Sara's complaint, it sounded like boot camp was from HE double hockey sticks. The complaint alleges Diddy eliminated contestants for complaining about not being fed. Only the female contestants were made to dance for or do choreography for Diddy. Plus, don't even think about crying or you're out of boot camp and not making the group. Now, obviously, Sara made it through and was chosen to be a part of the group, but that didn't mean things were easier from there. When describing that infamous walk for cheesecake, according to the complaint, that moment was for the group to pay their dues, and Diddy wouldn't allow the group to move into their home until they did it. Even if you don't live in New York City, you can only imagine how long of a walk from Manhattan to Brooklyn really is. But still, Diddy made them get the cheesecake or risk going home. That walk, according to the filing, took 6 to 8 hours, over 10 miles in the freezing cold. From there, it was more allegations of depriving the group of food, comments about Sara's body and how she needed to get firmed up. The filing says Sara was the only one Diddy scrutinized in a sexual and humiliating manner. Sara alleges one instance where she was recording in the studio. Diddy saw her walking through the hallways and backed her up against a corner, preventing her from moving. He then allegedly got so close to her where he could kiss her, and then asked her if she was doing okay and needed anything. According to the complaint, Diddy ran his hands across her breasts. Sara describes being frozen in confusion and fear. Then when Diddy went back to the studio, she walked as fast as she could away from him and left. Now, if you watch the show, you know how it ended. The group was made and it was called to band, but by the end of season 2 of the show, Diddy dismantled it. But Sara alleges her rejecting Diddy's advances and refusal to pose for Playboy led him to fire her and disband the whole group. Sara alleges Diddy was in breach of contract and never received any composition rights or credit for the songs used on season 2 and season 3 of Making the Band. She says the group was only given $5,000 in cash after tour performances. The only time she actually got a check was when she said she was pressured to sign to a publishing agreement with the company owned by Diddy's mom, Janice. So in exchange for her signature, she claimed she got a one-time payment of $25,000. And sure, $25,000 sounds like a lot, but not for years worth of work and filming all day and all night from 2002 to 2004. I want to give a huge thank you to Odoo for sponsoring our news stories. Odoo is an incredible all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications. And one of my favorites is Odoo's website builder. With their drag and drop features and AI copywriter, it helps me come up with website descriptions like the site I built for my sweet cat, Mr. Buttons. A couple minutes later, and I now have buttonsthecat.com. So again, a huge thank you to Odoo for sponsoring our news stories and getting me a website for my sweet Buttons, who is obviously an influencer now and is ready for his own brand deals. You can build your website now as well, and the domain is free for the first year when you use our link odoo.com/lcnewsweb. Again, that's odoo.com/lcnewsweb to try Odoo now for free. Sara claims the treatment she endured on the show outside of the alleged sexual harassment was inhumane. The filing claims Diddy was controlling and had outrageous demands like preventing Sara from eating until he said she could, mocking her bulimia, controlling her sleep schedule, forcing her to share a room with 4 men as a married woman, and Sara claims that she voiced her concerns to Diddy, MTV, Burr and Murray, but her concerns allegedly went ignored. And after her experience on the show, Diddy blackballed her from the music industry. Sara's not the only former Making the Band contestant who's made allegations against Diddy. Aubrey O'Day has remained vocal about her experience with her former boss. She claims she was also fired for rejecting Diddy's sexual advances. And when Diddy offered publishing rights back to her group Danity Kane, that amount totaled less than $350. Aubrey's group members D. Woods and Don Richard also made similar allegations. D. Woods claimed Diddy fostered an emotionally and verbally abusive work environment and said Aubrey confided in her about Diddy's behavior that made her uncomfortable. And then they were both fired from Danity Kane. Don Richard filed a lawsuit against Diddy last summer right before he was arrested. In Don's suit, she claimed that Diddy touched her inappropriately, locked her in a car for hours, and she witnessed him being physically abusive toward his ex-girlfriend Cassie. Diddy has denied all the allegations against him. And when it comes to Sara's lawsuit specifically, his legal rep said, quote, "This is yet another example of false claims being filed against Mr. Combs. No matter how many lawsuits are filed, it won't change the fact that Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted or sex trafficked anyone, man or woman, adult or minor. We live in a world where anyone can file a lawsuit for any reason. With the deadline for New York's Gender-Motivated Violence Act expiring tomorrow, it's clear that opportunists are rushing to file last-minute meritless claims. Mr. Combs remains confident he will prevail in court." Let's break down this nearly 150-page complaint with attorney and former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. Nima, always great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me. What's your reaction to this latest complaint filed against Diddy?
Elizabeth, I wasn't surprised that we saw lawsuits filed on the last day. Of course, the window is closing, so if anyone didn't file, they're probably going to be prevented from filing unless another state ends up opening the statute of limitations, or a city like New York did. So the fact that we're seeing these last-minute lawsuits is something that's typical. The fact that we saw so many is atypical, but of course we're dealing with someone who is facing dozens and dozens of lawsuits already.
And just before we get into more of this complaint, talk to me a little bit about how powerful that look-back window was that really allowed a lot of Diddy's alleged victims to file complaints and lawsuits against him, given that the statute of limitations in other cases would have been expired.
Elizabeth, it's really powerful. And with sex abuse and sexual assault, there's been a lot more recognition, and what legislatures have done is they've opened up these statute of limitations. It really started actually with the Catholic Church and the sex abuse cases. And what they tried to do is open the statute of limitations for both criminal and civil. The criminal was struck down as unconstitutional, a violation of the ex post facto clause. But these civil statute of limitations, because we're just talking about money, these windows, these openings, they have been allowed. And in Diddy's case, first it was New York State, and now New York City. And now both of those windows have closed. So unless someplace like California or Florida or someplace where sexual assault happened, someone could file a claim there, this is probably going to be the end of the road for most of the Diddy claims, at least certainly in New York.
Absolutely. And we still have a whole trial still waiting ahead that's just completely separate from all the civil complaints and lawsuits filed against him too. So still a lot of Diddy coverage, it feels like, will continue to be happening. When we talk about Sara Rivers's complaint against Diddy, formerly known as Sarah Stokes, are you surprised at the amount of defendants attached to this complaint? It names Making the Band camp instructors, dance choreographers, former assistants, tour managers, executives, essentially all the people who we saw as viewers on the show who worked for Diddy. Plus you have Paramount, you have MTV, you have Viacom, and even what stood out to me was Lou Pearlman was attached as a defendant, and he died in 2016. But what do you make of just this long list of defendants who are named in this complaint?
Like kitchen sink approach, a little bit of a different case. Obviously, there are allegations of sexual assault related to Diddy groping Rivers' breasts, but it's in many ways more of an employment complaint, sexual harassment and employment claims, as opposed to, the freak-offs, what we typically have been talking about, that sex trafficking. Obviously, there was a relationship between Rivers and Diddy and all these companies that you talked about, right? MTV, Universal, and they've all been thrown in there because really it's one of those situations where unless you name them now, you're probably not going to be able to amend later because of that statute of limitations. Probably overkill. I imagine that some of these defendants will be either voluntarily dismissed or they'll file motions to dismiss and they'll be out and the case will really be narrowed or pared down. But at least for now, they've all been named.
And this complaint also goes through every single episode of the season, including that infamous cheesecake episode, as well too of season 2 of Making the Band. But why do you think that Sara Rivers' lawyer kind of drafted the complaint that way, really kind of going into each and every single episode that we as viewers saw on the show?
It's definitely not something that you typically see, a complaint this long related to allegations this old. Now, there could be a couple of reasons. One, they had plenty of time to work on it, and they wanted to file and make sure that everything was included. They know that it's likely going to be subject to different types of motions. Obviously, the employers, they're going to try to get out for a number of reasons. They're going to say that, especially when you're dealing with sexual harassment, they had no notice. Now, under the law, if it's someone who's a manager, the entity is presumed to have notice, or there might be ratification, different type of legal arguments when it comes to assault. Oftentimes when you're dealing with these types of employment cases, the entity may want to get out and say, listen, someone did something unlawful, especially if something was a criminal act. That's not something that you can attribute to the company. And this is getting the legal weeds a bit, but entities, businesses are usually not in the business of committing crimes. So sometimes what judges will say is, well, look, if there's a criminal act, it's outside the course and scope of employment such that the entity is not vicariously liable. So I think what the plaintiffs are trying to do, and Rivers' lawyers, doing everything they can to say, hey, it wasn't just Diddy who did all this. The entity, they were on notice of his harassing conduct, and that's why they threw everything out there to try to get some other deep pockets on the hook here.
Well, given that, do you think that, in your opinion, that MTV, Viacom, Paramount may have enabled Diddy, given that the show was so popular, and kind of enabled him to continue going about his ways, given that he was bringing those views in at the time?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways you get to that entity level. The first is what I said is kind of vicarious liability, right? Where someone's acting on behalf of the company, they're in the course and scope of employment, and therefore the entity is liable. So that's one way they're going to try to get there. The corporate defendants are going to say, no, that's not the case. Making the Band had nothing to do with sexual assault. There's no way this conduct would have been accepted, would have been ratified by the corporation. This is the first we're hearing about it, right? Some 20 some odd years later. The other would be some sort of direct negligence type claim that doesn't say that the entity is directly responsible for Diddy's conduct, but they're responsible because they negligently hired him, they supervised him, sort of a lack of supervision, just general negligence claim. So you're going to see two different approaches in a case like this when it comes to the sexual assault. And then, of course, the harassment as well. There's plenty of laws that have been on the books for many years that protect employees from harassment by their employers, even if there is no sexual assault or contact.
And I know we've had, a number of conversations, especially when we talk about Sean Diddy Combs, and I know we often talk about just the power that he had exuded before his arrest and even before all the lawsuits came out. And looking through Sara's allegations against Diddy, it kind of echoes other allegations against Diddy, specifically, as we've been talking about, when it comes to this treatment of artists that he works with. He works in a hostile work environment, if we're going off the allegations of groping, allegations of firing when they refuse Diddy's sexual advances. And I know a lot of people, when we talk about these types of allegations, are always wondering, this was 20 years ago. Why didn't you talk about this beforehand? Why didn't you say anything? And why is this all just coming out now? But my question to you is, as a former federal prosecutor, what were you hearing from sexual abuse victims or sexual assault victims, especially in these high profile cases where they might have been fearful of the person that they're making these allegations against, and that may have deterred them from speaking out beforehand?
It's not uncommon for a sexual assault or sexual abuse or sexual harassment victim not to speak out when there is a disparity of power. And this is something that, not just in the Rivers case, but it even goes back to Cassie Ventura, right? Obviously, she was an artist. She's expressed concern about her career and what Diddy could do. He's one of the most powerful artists in the hip hop community, right? He can make or break you. So when there's this fear, when there's this disparity, when someone's career, right, their passion is on the line, they can be hesitant to come forward, especially when maybe they don't have money to hire a lawyer or they don't think anyone will believe them or even take their case. Now, of course, on the defense side, the argument is, well, the reason you didn't come forward is that this is all fabricated decades after the fact to try to shake someone down for money. You're just piling on. This is all made up. So what's really important in these types of cases is obviously if you have independent witnesses, that's great. Someone that saw this happening and they don't have any skin in the game and they come and they testify, oh yeah, I saw this harassing conduct or I heard it. If not, what's helpful is, you would like to have a contemporaneous report. Telling law enforcement, medical personnel, that would be great. But even a friend or family member, something that can come and say, back at or near the time when all this happened, so-and-so told me, whether it's Rivers, whether it's Ventura, anyone, that this was happening. That helps at least counter the argument that this is all fabricated after the fact.
And do you see this going to trial by any chance, by a jury at that?
Well, we'll see. I mean, obviously, the May criminal trial is the one that's the most important, right? Not just because it's a criminal case and could result in Diddy spending years or maybe even decades in prison. But it's interesting to see how much money he has left when it's all said and done. He's going to have to spend tens of millions of dollars at trial. He's obviously lost any deals that he had. Certainly his businesses, their value has tanked. So I'm not saying he's necessarily going to be broke, but there are a lot of civil claimants, more than 100. And the question is, how much money will he have if and when he's done defending all these civil cases? These folks may be getting pennies on the dollar at the end of the day.
And this one alone is just a $60 million complaint, $60 million lawsuit. But I also want to ask you, this was the plaintiff in this case, her attorney is Ariel Mitchell, formerly Ariel Mitchell Kidd, who was also named as a defendant in a lawsuit that Diddy brought on against her and another grand jury witness in his federal trial. What do you make of just that whole relationship, given that Ariel Mitchell is being sued by Diddy for defamation, but yet she brought about this lawsuit for her client for $60 million?
Well, sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and Diddy's been very aggressive with respect to Mitchell and Tony Busby and really others that have come out and made these claims publicly saying that they're defamatory. So anything that's in the lawsuit itself, that complaint that we talked about, that's protected by the litigation privilege. It can't be the subject of a defamation suit. But to the extent that allegations have been made, and there's all sorts of rumors out there, and some of them have been parroted by the lawyers, right? So we're talking about sex abuse, videos of the freak-offs. Obviously, we haven't seen any of those videos aside from the Cassie Ventura video at the hotel here in Los Angeles where I am. So to the extent that lawyers are saying things publicly that may not be true, and they're acting maliciously. So when you're talking about a celebrity like Diddy, someone in the public eye, the public figure, it's not just the statement being defamatory. Under most states' defamation law, it really has to be malicious, which means that the lawyer or the speaker knew that it was untrue or acted in reckless disregard for the truth. So obviously, we know that there's many folks who are filing against Diddy, but Diddy for now is going to try to strike back and make sure that he's sending a message and trying to get some money or really silence those who are making these public statements against him.
And when we talk about the workplace claims specifically, do you see a change in the music industry, especially in Hollywood? Do you see any type of change given everything that we're learning and that we know now about Diddy? Do you see any types of changes when it comes to manager-artist type of relationship or artist record label type of relationship and the treatment of the artists going forward?
I've represented a lot of victims against a lot of artists. I don't have any of the Diddy cases, but we have lots of cases against Kanye and Lizzo. We sued Jason Derulo. We have a trial against Soulja Boy happening right now in Santa Monica. So unfortunately, in the music industry where there's so many people who are desperate to break in, and there is this disparity. It can be music, it can be the entertainment industry. We even see it in reality TV. A lot of that, of course, is filmed here in Los Angeles as well. So when you have folks that are desperate to break in, sometimes you have people who are taking advantage of them. So unfortunately, Elizabeth, I have seen some change, but certainly not anywhere where we need to be when it comes to, men in positions of power not taking advantage of young women who don't have that power.
All right. Well, Nima Rahmani, I always appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Talk soon.
And again, Diddy has denied all the allegations made against him in the more than 35 civil lawsuits he still faces. He also pleaded not guilty to his federal criminal charges. Now, his trial is slated for May, but he has a hearing next Friday, and of course, we'll be live streaming that from outside the federal courthouse next week. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.